months ago, Andrew, as you remember, central banks around the world were in tightening mode. Now, many either just before and some after the Fed's pivot have turned easier themselves, either directly altering their rates or changing their guidance. Here's our global central bank tracker. Let's take a look at the Federal Reserve first. Well, of course, they've gone to patience from gradual increases. The ECB extended negative rates to the year end. They promised to stay there through the summer. The BOJ maintaining negative rates, and PBOC, the People's Bank of China. By the way, when I started doing this 20 years ago, I would have never put China up with the top four. And I'm trying to think who the fourth one I would have had. Would have been Switzerland, maybe, or Canada, whatever. Okay, now each one of these not only has a rate, they also have other policies, non-standard measures here. So let's take a look at where they are on that. Well, the Fed, of course, has said it's now going to end its balance sheet unwind this year. ECB announced a new lending facility in March that will happen in September. BOJ approved further asset purchases. And the People's Bank of China is figuring out a way to lend further support, especially to small business. Now, markets mostly have cheered these moves, especially since it came in direct response to a global sell-off and global economic weakening. But some remember, just a few months ago, the Federal Reserve had an explicit policy of normalization. One of those who remembers Ward McCarthy, chief financial economist at Jefferies, says, quote, "It raises the question, has the Fed given up on both rate normalization and balance sheet normalization? It worries me that they will not have the tools to deal with the next recession and or financial crisis." So is there something of a trade-off going on, folks? Easier policy now to address the recent downturn in return for what would be tighter policy later if there's a more substantial shock to the economy. I don't know that the markets have internalized that trade-off, but it might be one they've made.
All right, let's talk. Bring in Richard Fisher, and you heard Steve's report. Richard, he's former Dallas Fed president, Barclays senior advisor, septuagenarian.
Just turned 70.
Just recently. Happy
Thank
birthday!
You. Thanks for pointing that out to everybody. Wisdom comes with age.
Wisdom. We're in a pretty good place domestically, not such a great place globally. How's the Fed in terms of pushing the right buttons, whether it's easy or...
Well, let me go to what Steve was talking about, because when we talk about balance sheet normalization, there's a big headline. They're not going to go back to where they were before the crash, which is an $850 billion balance sheet. Well, now cash in circulation, the other side of the balance sheet is $1.7 trillion, headed to 1.8. You have greater reserves required because of the regulatory regime. They're now at 1.7 trillion. Add those two together, 3.4, probably 3.5 at the end of the year. The Fed's balance sheet now is at 4 trillion. So if they finish up this year, they're right on target, somewhere between 3.5, 3.75. No surprise whatsoever. And yet people have made a big deal out of this. As far as rates are concerned, I think Steve hit on the main point. And I've said this before on the show, will you have enough nuts in the tree for when the winter comes? And what is clear to me is we talked about this at the very beginning, including Jay Powell when he first came in June of 2012. Have we painted ourselves in a corner? How do you get out after administering an opioid of easy money for 10 years? The market's hooked on cheap money. And in Europe, look at that, the negative interest rate regime. What do they do next?
We think we're okay because inflation's not.
So if you're a short-term thinker, you're kind of a happy guy or a happy woman. Longer term, I think that's a good point that was raised. What do we do when we go into a downturn? What are the tools left? The federal funds rate, Fed funds rate, the key marker rate in the middle of the corridor, is at 240 right now. So the corridor is 2.25 to 2.5. That's not very much to give back. And the balance sheet has to be reduced. You can add it to an extent. I was a little disappointed to hear the head of the New York Fed talk about negative interest rates the other day. We know it's created a disaster in Europe.
500 bips, Richard. 500 bips is the average Federal Reserve response, as you know, to a recession. Well, if we did 500, we go negative 2.5.
Well, we're not going to go negative because we'll destroy the banking system. So this is what's really worrisome.
You should do percentage anyway, though, right? When you're already low, if you went down.
In other words, the percentage of the percentage.
But when you talked about the button, reminded me of Hillary Clinton's reset button. So we'll see.
That was not my intent. I'm sorry if I ruined your morning.
But you said you're just going through the math in terms of how the balance sheet is actually. I mean, when you take into account the extra reserves on the balance sheet from the banking system, et cetera, it's basically back to normal. And so don't we have those bullets to use? I mean, it's not
it's not quite there, but it's getting there. And what Powell has said and the FOMC has said is at the end of this year, we should be done. And remember, currency in circulation grows at 6% a year like clockwork.
But Richard, in a double,
it's already 1.7 trillion.
From these low rates, anyone would say, look, if you double 2 3/4 to 5.5 or whatever, it's a doubling. They wouldn't say it's 200 basis points.
Yeah,
so
I know.
You can't use the 500 basis points that we need as an absolute number.
Again,
but what about inflation? Inflation is low now. But what about? Did you see what our deficit's going to be between now and? I mean, where are we? 23 now.
We have a federal government
23?
issuing $1.3 trillion in new debt.
Yeah.
When one of the key buyers, the Fed, is no longer adding to its portfolio.
You haven't switched to this new monetary thing? I thought that was your deal. What's it called? What's it called? The new
it's the anti-Texas monetary policy.
Yeah, and it's combined with the new Green Deal. It all we've been thinking about all these things wrong, and capitalism. Let's get rid of it.
Even Larry Summers is against the modern money,
which is that speaks volumes.
That's right. So he's a darling of sort of the middle to left wing Democratic Party, and he's against it.
Middle. In what world?
All right.
Middle.
In the Joe Kernan world, he's
oh my God, he's out. Yeah, and right. Well, and you're a Democrat, but you're from Texas, so you're further right than I am.
I'm right there where Melissa is.
You're right
in
the middle.
Stuck in the middle.
Do you? I mean, we've sort of. We're laughing about the new monetary. What's it called, Steve? The new
modern monetary theory.
Laughing about
it's like 60 years old.
Right. Okay. But it's in vogue now. But we are going to do some serious printing one of these days, aren't we?
Really are.
I've been worried about this for 40 years, and it doesn't seem to bother people. When Nixon started running up those deficits, George Shultz tells a great story. He said he was worried about it. He called an aide in, a guy named Sam Cohen. Said, is there any real difference between Republicans and Democrats in Congress when it comes to spending money? You know what the answer was? Yes, sir, there is. Democrats enjoy it more. But other than that, there's no difference. Congress likes to spend money, and now we have a president who's levering the government.
I want to follow up on something I think Joe was getting at. If he wasn't, I want to get at it, which is we have these big deficits. If the Fed raises rates, it's going to mean that what is already happening, which is that interest as a percentage of total debt ends up being a bigger part.
That's right.
It makes it even harder. To what extent does the Fed need to keep that in mind?
You know, I think the market can raise rates depending on how you equilibrate supply and demand. We have more supply and we have less demand coming, say, from the central bank. The one thing we have going for us, Steve, is we are relatively very attractive to the rest of the world. So if you look at the 10-year auction yesterday, it was a pretty healthy auction.
2.61.
That's right. So I think it's not just money coming here, it's money that won't go out in a negative yield world that makes us very attractive. But I don't know how long that lasts. So you make a good point, but I don't think it's the Fed's job to respond to that. The markets will respond and drive rates higher if, indeed, we don't have enough foreign demand for our stuff.
Things are about to change.